All righty. Well, thank you for coming, and yeah, it's back to me after quite a while. And so today we are going to look at reverse pitching, which of course is basically what your assignment 2 is about, but there's also something to help us to think about the literature when we are doing research. But before I start, let me just see if there's any questions that people have. You guys can hear me, right? Yes, okay, good. All right. All right. So any questions? Okay, just announcement. So due to unforeseen circumstances, we need to cancel one of the workshops on week 8. I know this is really not ideal because we are already not having many workshops, but quite unfortunately, we can't find any way around this. So if you have planned to attend the Tuesday workshop on the 26th of April, then please feel free to attend another workshop in that week. You can find the workshop timetable under course help on the course blackboard site. Mid-semester break is coming. Is this coming Friday until the Monday, 25th of April. And so we won't have any lecture or consultation during the mid-semester break. But if you do have anything urgent that you need me, just feel free to send me an email. I know quite a number of you might be wishing to see the feedback and your score on the annotated bibliography. We are hoping to complete all the grading by the end of this week, hopefully. Then we should be able to release the grades and comments. Now, but before that, I probably should mention that there are some common issues that I'm seeing so far. The first thing is not devastating, but is kind of annoying and it does affect your mark is we have seen many inaccurate or incorrect, sometimes inconsistent citations. And this comes most frequently when people are citing online resources. So either a paper is being published online first as a journal, and in that case, you should still put the journal name. You won't have the number and issues or page number, but you should still put the journal's name. I mean, you should still put in the title of the journal and put online first or forthcoming, and then give the link. That's one thing. If it is a working paper online, then you should put the title and then say working paper and say which working paper series it is. But also other things that typically comes up is that not knowing what is the journal name. If you search for an article through Science Direct or Scopus or Science Direct themselves are not journal name. You need to still give the name of the title, number, and issues of that journal. Yes? 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 That's a question? Right. I mean, feel free to ask or pop it in chat if you want to ask. Without saying. Yeah, but just make sure that Scopus or Science Direct, they are not titles of journals. So, they shouldn't, they they are not to be, you can't cite them. They are just a database that lead you to journals. So, you don't cite them. Likewise, sometimes you need to figure out which is the journal title and which is, say the publisher or something. And we see a lot of these. Another thing is inconsistency, because a lot of the time students do like to download, when you see a paper, and then most likely different websites, different journals, they do give you the options that click, cite this article, and then they give you a citation, then you can download to your computer, to whatever citation software that you are using. But the problem of that is that different websites have different formatting, different style, and different way of handling, say, special characters or special cases. And so typically, if you just download that one, import it into your whatever referencing software, and not manage it manually yourself, you are going to get things that are very inconsistent. Not so much that I have seen in this particular assignment, but say sometimes I have seen in other assignment is that it's actually the same author, but then because different, let's say, they have those French or French last name that is the blah blah, how they handle the D apostrophe, whether it's capitalized, it's not capitalized, does it count as, the it was the person list under D or the letter after the apostrophe. These will all differ when you grab the things from different website. So you do need to manually kind of clean it to make sure everything is consistent. Otherwise, what we are seeing is that sometimes you give the first name, sometimes you don't give the first name, sometimes you give the initial, sometimes it's first name and then last name, sometimes it's last name and then first name, and it's quite messy, honestly. Now, I kind of feel that some of you would be a bit disappointed when you see your mark, but let me also just say that so far what I am seeing, the high and low marks are often separated by the ability to distinguish between the main and auxiliary elements of the paper cited. So what do I mean by that? A paper might cover a lot of things, but when it comes to what is the main point usually is quite clear. You can sum it down to one or two sentences. The other things are the auxiliary elements of the paper that either expands the main question or the main result, or they motivate the main result, or their implications of the main result, or their application of the main result. And the ability of separating these usually makes the difference in this particular assignment, because when you know what is the main part and what is the auxiliary part, then you can give very concise and precise summary, and they are very informative. When you cannot distinguish between these, and then what I'm saying is the student don't know, and they see that the paper has a lot of things, and they try to capture everything, and at the end you see that it's just a listing of a lot of many different elements without a logical structure to it. And usually those assignments get a low mark, despite the student spending a lot of effort into reading the paper. Yes, there was reading of the paper, there might even be understanding of the paper, but there's not much of an interpretation of a paper in terms of what is the important aspect and what are the secondary aspect to that paper. Now, your research question does not count towards any mark, but if you write down a research questions that are very hard to answer, or that was too broad, then typically what happened is that you can link your bibliography item back to your question, and usually that would lead to low marks too. So I know that some students thought that, oh, if I have a broader question, that tends to be more interesting or does have more appeal, but sometimes they are not very answerable. So what you want is that you want a question that is answerable. By answerable, I mean that when you ask the question, you can have an idea of what the answer may look like. You may not know exactly what it is, but you have an idea. So let's say if you ask, what is the effect of COVID-19 on something? I don't know what the something is. You can probably say, and 1% in, or let's say COVID restriction, and then let's say there's a score of how restrictive the restrictions are, from some agency, I don't know. And you can say a 1 standard deviation increase in the severity of lockdown measure results in, how many percentage change in percentage increase in the say mental health cases at hospital or something like that. So that would be a conceivable answer, right? And if you ask a question that you can see a conceivable answer, that would be better than a question that you don't even know what, and there's not even a sense of what an answer could be like. But having said that, just because your question is narrow doesn't mean that your literature search should be narrow. I think one of the mistakes that some of you made is that they have a very narrow question. Say they only want to say, oh, how does this thing works in Australia? So they put Australia into the search term, and then of course they are going to get a very few literature, because Australia is such a small country, nobody cares about us. In this case, actually, you probably should drop Australia in your search term and just see what are the things that have been done elsewhere or in other cases, and that might also inform your research as well. So if you want to research on something, something in China, a good idea is actually not to search with the word China in your search term. You can always look at all the things that are available, and if there are any particular countries or or sectors or whatever that you want to focus on, you can pick out those manually, and that would be a much more effective search strategy in terms of literature search. Okay, but that would be what we had already done. And I know that we have had many guest lectures in between the last time I was talking until this time, but I don't know if you have noticed that there are some themes that keeps coming up and coming up and coming up. And I think there's no coincidence. Let me just tell you that all these guest lecturers, they have not coordinated among themselves. So, it's not as if they thought about, we all have to say this. And many of them did not even coordinate with me very much. So, I didn't tell them what to say. But the fact that you keep hearing the same thing over and over again, because those are common experience from any researchers. And some recurring themes that I do want to pick out and point out is, first of all, there's really no one recipe for research. And this actually have been said by many people in 100 different ways. What does it mean? It's not that I want to say, look, I really can't teach you how to do research. No, there's no one recipe, but there are typical ways of getting around it. But what I want to say is that don't think that this is just about, like answering a problem set or doing an exam, that as long as I do this, then, I should get good marks, or I should, it should be successful. Unfortunately, when it comes to research, there's a lot of uncertainty, and therefore nobody knows exactly what one should do. Even the most experienced researchers, they might not always know what is going to happen in their own research. But even then, even when there's no recipe, I can't tell you, just do this, do that, put it into a mixing bowl, mix, and then you can get a cake. There's nothing like that. But research is really about the what, why, and how. Andreas used these three words, what, why, and how. When it was Robert Favre, then he was actually using his whole template to really encircle the what, why, and how. And ultimately, all it comes down to is, what is your research about? Why do we care about it? And how do you do it? And all three aspects have their importance. If you don't know the what, you can't really talk about the next two. But even when we know the what, we need to know why we should be doing it. Why should anyone be interested in it? And then, of course, there is the question of then how are you going to do it? It's good to just sit here and say, I want to have the grandest theory about, human interaction. Well, I hope someday we can get to that point. But before that, we need to know how we are going to handle our research. And it is between the what, why, and how that we have tension between whether we should have a broader scope or a narrower scope, whether the tension between interesting and feasible. But, at the very end of it, you need to be able to answer these three questions: the what, why, and how. Now, a lot of it then actually comes down to understanding the literature. But understanding is not just, I read many papers, I know what they are talking about. The other thing is also that you see the paths from it. And how do we get to that point implicitly? It is really about how well you know the relevant fields of economics. So in a sense, although this is not what this course is covered, I can't teach you labor economics here. I can't teach you game theory here. I mean, we don't have time for all these things, and economics is so broad. How can we actually cover every bit of it? But if you do want to do, say, research in game theory, make sure that you brush up your game theory. If you want to do research in labor economics, make sure you brush up your labor economics. And if you had not, better either take a course or find a textbook or something. Because if you don't understand the underlying economics, it's actually very hard for you to cut through the literature and see the path from it, as what I was putting here. There was actually one more thing that I want to say, but I forgot what it was. Yes. So yes. I remember that when I was a junior PhD student and I saw the senior student presenting their research, and then sometimes the professor just asked them about, oh, but that paper, blah, 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 blah. And the student can answer on the spot, but that paper does this, I do this, it's different, they were actually trying to do A, but then, A is actually not quite possible, but then in order to do A, they need to assume assumption B, and then here I don't assume assumption B, and I was able to do C, something like that. And sitting there, I was very amazed at how can they know every paper. There's so many papers. How can they know papers so well? And then, of course, when I became a senior student, I did the same thing as well. The reason is not because I sit there try to memorize all the paper. Actually, I did not. Who cares? We don't have exams anymore. The reason is that I worked with them so much and in such a depth that those papers whole idea was already imprinted in my mind. I don't need special effort to remember them. If someone asks me about certain paper, I can just answer it on top of my head because I know it inside out already. And of course, you don't need to do this for every paper, but there would be 1 or 2 paper that has this status in your research. And basically what we are going to talk about today is exactly how we kind of rein in that paper and make it work for us. So we have done our annotated bibliography. We see how the literature is related to what we want to do. Now, then what do we do? Where do we go from there? Now, usually, and especially for thesis as well, a lot of research is really very closely related to 1 or at most 2 paper, and I try to call them truly relevant paper here, in the sense that the new research that we are doing had inherited a lot of things from that truly relevant paper. It can be inheriting the question itself. That paper asked a very important question. It had not been completely answered. So, you take part of that question and you try to answer it. That's one possibility. Many more often is inheriting the method. Someone used this method to solve problem A, and I realized that this method can be used to solve problem B as well, and with some modified way, and you are trying to use it that way. Yeah. So there is usually this paper that we follow very closely. And sometimes if you read some paper, you actually would even see this phrase, this papers follow closely, blah, 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 either in terms of methodology or in terms of, framework, the logic. And if you do put the 2 papers together, you can see the parallel. And that's actually a good way of doing research, because it's usually feasible. You follow someone's footstep. Yeah, it might not be groundbreaking, but for a thesis, that's not a bad idea. And it's usually also manageable within a limited time, which is why this approach is quite common when with master or honors thesis. Andreas was very kind to provide a few examples of the thesis that he has supervised last week, and you actually see that those papers are basically take a paper, put a twist to it, and then that makes a thesis. Now, whether that is good or not for, say, further research like PhD research or research for publication really depends on what your twist is. So some really even groundbreaking research is just putting a twist on what we already know, but that twist is a very fundamental one, and therefore the paper becomes groundbreaking. So I'm not saying that just putting a twist to an existing paper is necessarily a bad or uninteresting way of doing research. Although, the higher the level you go, then, the more scrutiny you would face in terms of whether the twist is actually a meaningful one. For master thesis, honestly, even the marking criteria for master thesis, we understand that it is done in a limited time. It's not as if you have a lot of time, room to do a lot of innovation. So we don't ask for too much of that innovation. And, a little twist on an existing paper often is acceptable enough. Of course, when you go further, you should aim higher though. But what is that twist? That twist can be, a change in assumptions. The original paper assumed A1, A2, A3, and you feel that A3 is too restrictive and you want to change it to A3 prime, which is a less restrictive assumption, and that conveniently apply to situation X, right? For instance, so that your new assumption can allow us to answer something about X. That's a possible way of twisting something. Another possibility is that, okay, you use different data set, you basically follow the same methodology and use a different, and apply it to different data. Again, this is probably not very desirable when you get to PhD or even further on, but for master thesis, that's completely acceptable. Sometimes we add a different dimension. If something is static, we might ask, what happens if it's dynamic? If some aspect is exogenous, we might ask, what if we endogenize it? Say, if labor supply is considered fixed in some model, we might ask, what if labor supply is endogenous? And that will be adding a different dimension to the paper, and sometimes that works too. But before we can add a twist to a paper, we need to know it well. And when I say know it well, it doesn't mean that you can recite the paper from back to front. Most of us can't do it. Even for the paper that we know very, very well, there will be some tiny details that we miss. But you should know why the details are there. So I may forget about the details of a paper, and that's very common. But the important thing is that we need to understand why those details are there. Is it very important? Is it preliminary? Is it something that can be dropped without much consequences? Or is it something that is very crucial to the result? And those are the things that we really want to get from a paper to understand how we can make changes to it. You don't want to make changes to something that is inconsequential. Sometimes how to say, we assume that say the consumption of some goods is continuous. Well, that's most of the time just a simplifying assumption. If you try to insist that I want to do integer cases, yes, it's a change, but it's not a change that is likely to bring much differences. So you need to know what are the important building blocks of that paper. So what it means is that you want to get the logical flow of the paper. You want to know the paper's what, why, and how. So not just your own what, why, and how, but what's the paper, what, why, and how. And that brings us to the method of reverse pitching, because pitching is to basically clarify your own what, why, and how, and reverse pitching is kind of doing the what, why, and how for a paper that is already published. Now, before I get into that, I should kind of say that, look, there are many methods to do the same thing. And to be very honest, when I was doing my PhD, I had no idea of this pitching thing. So of course I do it the very old school method of just get some paper and write some details notes about the papers that I was reading. These kind of methods actually work well when you have been exposed to some research, especially, let's say if you have attended many seminars and you kind of get the hang of how research are typically structured, you would have a good sense, even just coming across a paper, of being able to pick out the different parts of the paper. And in that case, doing things freehand actually is quite efficient too. But before we get to that, probably having a little bit more structure is better. There are also many ways to get the structure. The reason that I'm introducing this is not because, I think this is the best way or the only way, but because this is a convenient way. And it also links back to how you can present your own research idea too. So if you have been to lecture 4, you would have heard about research pitching. And then research pitching is about your own research. You try to pitch your own research. You try to fill out that little template that force you to think about the important element of your research plan. Now, pitching your own research is doing something that hasn't happened yet, right? So you're making a proposal. Reverse pitching is kind of reverse engineering an original research plan that had already resulted in a research being done. So I'm going to call sometimes I'm going to refer to when you are reverse pitching, sorry. I'm going to call the paper that you are reverse pitching for the underlying paper or the research study. And that is something that had already been done. You're looking at that paper, but now you're trying to go back and reverse engineer the original research plan of this paper. But why should I do this? Well, the first reason, and I think that is the most important reason, is that it gives you a systematic way of dissecting a paper. You know, I pick up a paper, the paper, yes, it has introduction, and then depending on what kind of paper it is, you know, sometimes model, data, result, analysis, extension, stuff like that. It has all the sections, but what is it really trying to get down to? Or what kind of problem is it tackling? What are the tools that it is pulling out to tackle those problems? Very often, it is not that obvious from a first read. So we do want to, if this is really a paper that we think is very important for our own research, you really want to dissect it. You really want to have a very good view of the paper. So the reason why I like this rather than just telling students, oh, you read the paper and then blah, 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 is that if I just tell you to read the paper, you can very easily get bogged down by details. You know, you read the paper, at some point, something doesn't seem to be very easy or seems to be confusing, then you just drill down there, but then, you know, it might not give you much information. So the reverse pitching, because that is a template, that is a structure, it forces you to find out all those elements. So it forces you to go inside the paper. You need to read it. You need to find out what it is about. But it also diverts your attention away from the technical details, you know, from technical details that is more of the details of how it is being done, not the why using it or how using it. So for us, reverse pitching is really just for reviewing a paper. So it's not so much for evaluating the paper. But if you want, you can also use it for diagnostic purposes, meaning that there is a paper that is already done and you want to know how well or how good it is, then you can also run a reverse pitch and then see what comes up in each of the elements and ask yourself, are these good relative to the standard in the literature? You can do it to your own paper or to someone else's paper. Although just from experience, I think this use is, especially on someone else's paper, is rather limited. I'm definitely not going to do a reverse pitch for the paper, you know, on the paper that I'm refereeing. For your own, it might help, but if you already have started out with a good research plan, you probably don't need this afterwards to evaluate your own paper anyway. But one more important reason is that it gives you a chance to practice pitching before having to pitch your own research. So you can see how you would do the whole pitch with someone else's research without having to think about your own one. So all the materials are available to you. And when you see how it is being done, it's easier to see how yours can be done later. So this is the reverse pitch, an empty one. And I just pull it off from the, oops. I just pull it off from the pitching research website. So I'm not claiming any credit for it. You can see if you have the normal pitching research template with you right now, you can see that it's basically the same except for part A and part K. When it was part A, you were asked for your own research for something that has not been done. You were asked to give a working title. Here, you were asked to give a full reference because this is something that has already been published. So full reference just means that the full bibliography reference to that research work, the citation, the full citation. And then the last bit that was different was the last part K. If you were just pitching a research that had not been done yet, part K would be any other concerns that you want to note. Here, part K becomes 3 key findings. Because this research has already been done, so you know the result. So part K is talking about their result. And we'll get into these 2 parts later. The other parts are basically the same, except that this time it's not about your own research, but something that you need to pull out from the paper. So part A is very straightforward, just a full reference of the paper. Do I need to say more? But I'm repeating myself. I just said it in half an hour ago that please get your referencing right. So yes, please. I know it's hard because referencing is a messy matter, but yeah, please do get it right. Okay, part B is the basic research question. And here you are asked to define the key features of the research questions in 1 sentence. And you might start screaming at me and say, just 1 sentence? The paper is about so many things. Well, the paper might be about so many things and it might answer a lot of different questions, but there should be 1 main focus. Basically, all good papers have only 1 focus. And from that focus, they can actually get answers to many different things. And I also said no more than 3 elements in this basic research question. Elements means the things that actually goes into the question. You know, a research might ask for the impact of X on Y, and that would be, and that from there it might be the impact conditional on income and education level or something like that. So then the main research question would be, what is the impact of X on Y conditional on income and education level? You know, something like that. And that would be the main research question. Now, if you find that you can't summarize it in 1 sentence and it's more complicated than that, either the paper is dysfunctional, you know, some papers are dysfunctional, I have to say, you know, just because something is peer reviewed and published doesn't mean that it's necessarily good. And this I have to say, some of you pull out some papers that actually, when I looked at the paper, I was like, yeah, I'm just surprised that someone can actually publish something like this. But just because something is peer reviewed, just because something is available at UQ Library, just because something is published does not necessarily mean that it is good. And there indeed are dysfunctional papers out there. So if you really try very hard and you still can't see what the focus of the paper is, it might be the problem of the paper. And at that point, you probably want to think of, can I give an example of a dysfunctional paper? Look, not really, because I have seen those when I was refereeing and I told the editor not to accept them. I mean, I recommend rejection for those papers, but I have seen them. Of course, these won't be famous paper. It won't be paper at top journal. Typically, those are quite, even if it is dysfunctional, it can't get that far. But, I have referee for some lower rank journal, and there are really some papers that comes in and say, an example of one sentence to define key features. Well, I need a paper to do that, right? Let me think. If you were here last week with the AER paper that Andreas gave us as a challenge, then when you summarize the key question of that paper, the question would be, are the ex-ante factors, it would be what explains the difference of different startup performance and whether ex-ante factors are more important than ex-post factors, right? That would be a one-sentence summary of that paper. I mean, you can duck up that paper, it's still on Blackboard, but if you remember that paper, if you ask me to give a one-sentence basic research question. And by the way, if you do want to see examples of how these reverse pitching is done, the website that I actually put up also on Blackboard have quite a lot of example. Yes, if you can use one sentence, we do need to use one sentence to define our own research question. Actually, very, very often, even when you get to, say, if you attend a seminar, typically people would have a punchline or a bottom line. And even I remember once I have written up a paper with co-authors, and we were talking to a senior professor at the school, and we were asking him, say, can you give us some advice on what we should do with this? And he also asked us, what's the bottom line of your research? Give me just in one sentence, tell me what you have done. And this is actually very common. I mean, in seminars, you do it. When you publish, you do it. It's not even just an exercise because you need to fulfill this course requirement. It's something that we do all the time. And also, when we look for jobs as well, when we are at interviews, people say, what are you research about? You get one sentence to talk to people about that. What do? You really don't have 5 minutes to talk about that. Yeah, so I was saying, I think the part of it, if it is completely impossible to summarize in one sentence, okay, I give you two at most. Either there's something wrong with the paper, or someone is confused. It can be the authors that was confused, and therefore, the paper is all over the place, and things like that do exist. But it might also be you can't see what the paper is really wants to do. And in that case, you probably want to read over the introduction again to get a very clear idea of what the paper wants to achieve. The paper might claim that they have achieved 10 things, but at the beginning, they usually will set out to tell you that there's one thing that they want to achieve, and actually in doing so, they are also even managed to do 9 other things. And that one thing is the basic research question here. Now, I already said that you should look into the introduction, because the clearest indication of what the research question is most likely in the introduction, and most likely within the first 3 paragraphs of the introduction. Again, if a paper can't get to its bottom line within the first 3 paragraphs, there's usually something wrong, or the first paragraph is just one sentence or something. You can look into the abstract too. The abstract quite often would also have that information for you. You want to look out for phrases like we study, we examine, we investigate, this paper considers the question that we are looking at, the question of this paper, the main question of this paper, any wordings like this is leading you to the point where the authors really want you to understand what the paper is about. And as I say, a lot of times these are, good paper usually makes it very clear so that you can follow what they want to do. So after you have summarized the research question, the next item is the key papers. It is the key papers for the paper that is already published. So they are the papers that are cited by the paper that you are reverse pitching. So it's not as if you need to find three other papers to support it. The underlying paper, the paper that you are reverse pitching, should tell you what are the key papers for that. These are the papers that most critically underpins the topic or methodology, or why they are looking at something. Now, if you look in economics, depending on which field in economics that you're looking at, but typically you will have more than 20 citations within the paper, and very often up to 40 or 50. Now, when we talk about key papers, these are the ones that are most influential in terms of how they influence the author's thinking. Most likely, they are the ones that motivate the author's work. Why they start out this research project is because someone else has done this paper and they want to, and they have something to answer it. In a sense, it might not be obvious to you, but in a sense, all these publishing are actually a form of communication among academics. Someone has an idea, they want everyone to know, they publish a paper. And then when I publish a paper, someone else has some opinion about it or some recommendations about it or something that they want to add on to it, then they publish another paper. We usually don't see it this way, but there's actually a lot of communication within the academic community that goes through the publication process. Of course, behind it, there's a lot of seminars, conference that the communication is going on, but the papers themselves are actually part of that communication, and which is why you often see that there is a clustering of papers around certain topics. Sometimes the journals particularly have a special issue, but even without special issue, you will see clustering of papers that are on similar topics, related topic, or kind of coming in around the same time. That's because there's actually that communication going on. So in that communication, there are papers that are most influential in terms of how they influence and other papers' authors doing the work. So it might motivate the work, it might seed the idea or the hypothesis. Someone says something like that. Well, an implication of their paper would be this hypothesis. Do I see it? Do I not see it? Can I test it? Something like that. That happens quite often, especially in experimental economics as well. Someone else done something from the work. Some of the hypotheses would be like this. Can I test it in the lab? And then you will see the experimental paper doing the test. And also quite often the influence comes through the methodology. This is a very good method of either modeling or measuring or doing estimation of something, and therefore the other authors use the same or similar methodology and do something, but on a different dimension, on a different topic, something like that. And that in that case, the later paper also tends to follow very closely on the early. Also tends to follow the earlier paper very closely. So you want to look for those key papers. Where do you find them? Now, if the paper is truly influential, in most cases, they would be mentioned at least once in the introduction. Now, although the introduction is the places that you will find most citation anyway. So just because a citation is in the introduction doesn't necessarily mean that it is important. But if it is an important paper and it's not mentioned in the introduction, then, you know, either sometimes there's something special going on, but most of the time is it really that important? Now, sometimes, but it is very rare these days, that a paper might have a literature review session, and within that session you can actually identify the authors tends to give you a very nice picture of how the current paper is related to a bunch of different literature. And if you do have a session like that, it would be quite helpful for you to figure out the relationship between different papers that the current paper is citing. Although these days nobody writes a session on literature review, even journals consider it a waste of paper length. Rather, you tend to have the literature review already merged into the introduction. So you will need to look through the introduction. Now, also remember that just because a paper is cited early doesn't necessarily mean that it is the most important one. Sometimes the early paper are just the one giving background information. And then a few paragraphs later, you actually find the most influential paper. If the key paper is the one that informs methodology, then they are likely to show up again in the methods or estimation session. But in that case, you should distinguish between citation for a general tool. So whenever someone uses that tool, they always cite that paper, versus citation for a specific idea or method. So what are the examples of a general tool? You know, in experimental economics, there's something called Hot Larry method to elicit risk preference. So whenever someone says, oh, we elicit preference using a Hot Larry method, there will be a citation of Hot and Larry, but Lowry, I think. But that doesn't mean that they are really informing the main method. It is just a citation that everyone would have to do whenever they use that method, whenever they use that tool. I'm pretty sure that there's something similar when it comes to applied research as well. You know, when you need to use a GMM, you cite Hansen, or when you ever need to do a head kit, then you cite Heckman, that sort of stuff. So the last part of the kind of first summary or what part of a reverse pitch and also all pitching is the motivation or puzzle. And this is the academic motivation of the paper. Why should we be interested in working on this research question? Now, very often, well, I shouldn't say very often, but quite a lot of the time, it includes a puzzle that the authors are trying to solve. When I say puzzle, it means a gap in the literature or some missing pieces, or maybe we already know the answer in case 1, case 2, and case 2A, but we don't know the answer to case 2B and case 3. And somehow in the current paper, the authors realized that case 2B can be viewed as a special case of a special extension of case 3, and so they're looking at case 3, and then they want to answer that what will happen in that case, and that will also provide the answer to case 2B, something like that. So when we talk about motivational puzzle, we're talking about something that academics need to know but didn't know. And the paper is coming up to try to fill that gap. Where to find this piece of information is usually in the introduction, and actually most likely in the first few paragraphs. Occasionally, it might come a bit later, but usually first few paragraphs, you'll see it. But this is actually one item that you might need to piece things together, because you might need to pull out information from different paragraphs to actually put it together to actually say that, oh, you know, this is the part that it was missing, and therefore this is why we need to know it. It's unlikely to be as readily available as the items that you can just you see it and you can just pull it out from the paper. Okay, then we actually get to the how part of the paper. So the next three parts is idea, data, and tools. These are the how of the paper. So now we have a puzzle here. We have a motivation here. How are we going to tackle it? And in this case, how did the paper tackle it? So the idea part is the intellectual idea that makes the research works. How it looks like would differ across fields of research. So let me just give you an example. If it is a theory paper, then an idea is usually the intuition. Or if you actually look for the word intuition within a theory paper, you will usually see the authors explaining why they set up or why the theorem works, giving a verbal explanation of why that is the case. That is the idea. Sometimes when you have a theory paper that is just attempting to prove some open conjecture, then the idea would take the form of a strategy of proof. How are we trying to prove this open conjecture? And very often this is linked to, what have we already know about, things related to this open conjecture, and how we go to close that gap to prove this. Again, in theory paper, if you are more in applied theory rather than very mathematical theory, then the idea might also involve a new assumption that is relative to the literature. So nobody has ever assumed this before. Now we assume this, and that actually changed the result, or does change how things, all the mechanism, or change the underlying intuition and mechanism. And sometimes the idea also stems from there. So you might want to pick that out if you are looking at a theory paper. And by theory paper, I mean paper that okay, I should be careful. Very loosely speaking, for theory paper, I mean paper that does not have data. But of course, it's more than that. And actually, if you're interested, I can tell you my story of how I actually get into trouble for saying that a theory paper is any paper that does not involve data, and that almost got me chopped up by James Heckman. But anyway, that was, I should be careful that a theory paper is one that the main focus is actually the derivation of the result, and they actually might contain some data, but kind of loosely speaking, papers that doesn't have much data. And hopefully Heckman would not chop me up right now. He wouldn't hear this anyway. Now, if you're working on an experimental paper, then the ideas will usually take the form of a hypothesis or some hypotheses. It might also come in the way of how dependent variables are being measured, or how the control and treatments are being set up, because sometimes the novelty is there. Sometimes the reason why an experimental paper managed to make a contribution to the literature is exactly because it changed the way of how they set up the control and treatment. But very frequently, what you will see is that they have some hypothesis that they want to test, or they have some ideas of what things are supposed to be like under control and treatment. Now, if you're working with paper with secondary data, again, I say secondary here, but it might be survey data. So quantitative, experimental data, quantitative, non-experimental data. Okay. Then the main idea would be an identification strategy. If you have been to our applied economics guest lecture 2 weeks ago, Hai-Shan actually gave us a very, very good overview of how applied economics do identification, which is the crux of the matter in applied economics. So very often identification is the main idea. How do I identify a certain effect? Now, of course, to see how the identification strategy works, you need to know what are the main dependent and independent variables, what are the explanatory variables, what are the outcome variables, and in particular, whether there are any endogeneity issues. So any omitted variable possible, or whether there are any self-selection, self-selection, omitted variable, unobserved characteristics is really just an omitted variable, but stuff like that. And I think this is also one part that I kind of slightly disagree with Robert Favre, is that he probably would put the identification strategy in the tools part, but I tend to put it in the ideas part, because you can't really talk about how you're going to use difference and difference unless you know what the difference and difference are for, or a regression discontinuity. It's not just a tool, because it's very closely linked with, how you are going to use, where you can find that regression discontinuity. So I tend to put it in the ideas part. How can you identify the effect that you are actually looking for? So where to find it really then depends on the types of paper, right? But I already mentioned all the keywords that you would see whenever it is being mentioned. For theory paper, the keywords will be intuition or mechanism, channel. For experimental paper, it will be hypothesis, design, experimental design. For applied paper, then it would be identification, right? So most paper actually would have mentioned the idea in the introduction, because this is something that is very crucial. Without the idea, the whole paper cannot work. We might have a question, but without the idea, we won't be able to ever get to an answer. The idea is the starting point of how the answer should be like. So because this is so crucial, it usually would be mentioned in the introduction. But introduction usually mention it very briefly, because there's not enough space for the authors to really spell out, the full idea, or also, the exact details of how it would work. So it usually is mentioned in a free-take manner without much details, but that free-take mention should give you the hint to look for more details when it's mentioned later. So you do want to use the introduction, the hints in the introduction, to find this piece of information. Now, once you have an idea, then you need to put the idea into something that works, and that is called data. So for paper that is using secondary data, what is data, or to summarize the data, are fairly straightforward. So you might want to give information on what data are being used, what country data, what is the setting, unit of analysis, whether it's individual data, firm data, sectoral data, country data, blah, blah, blah. Sampling period, when are the data sampled? That sometimes can be very important, especially if something really significant occurred within the sampling period. A sampling interval is also very important too. If you are using financial data, you can have daily or even down to hourly data, right? More often you might have monthly or quarterly, or sometimes annual data. Annual data probably won't give you too many data points, so you might be worried about that. Definitely you want to know the sample size. That tells you kind of the statistical power of any statistical test. And the sampling nature, whether it's a cross-section data, time series data, panel, balanced panel, unbalanced panel, panel with attrition, so on and so forth. Data sources, when it comes to data source, whether it is publicly available, but with restricted access, proprietary data, meaning that you need to pay for those, sometimes it might be data collected by the authors themselves. And sometimes you also want to note whether it is linked data sets, so two different data sets but being linked together by the authors. Sometimes now for experimental paper, the data is about the experiment, right? So when and where are the experiments run? Whether it's a lab experiment, field experiment, a mixture of both or something else, virtual reality experiment. These are coming up, although not sure how fast they will catch up. The subject pool, students or people recruited online. The sample size for experimental paper, that is actually of particular importance, because economic experiments have typically we need to pay the subject. So increasing the sample size is actually very costly, because to have some more subjects, you need to pay more. And not everyone has those big research funds to just pay experimental subject, right? So a lot of the experimental paper, they try to use the smallest sample size that they want to get in order to have enough statistical power for their hypothesis testing. So you do want to note that if you are working on an experimental paper. Now you also want to know how are the experiment run, whether they are just they are computer-based, whether they are real efforts by observation or something like that. How the treatments and control are being imposed, are they within subject or between subject treatments? And if it is within subject treatments, how are the treatment orders determined or assigned? And of course, most subjects are incentivized in economic experiments, but you also want to know which part of it is incentivized, because sometimes some part of the experiment is incentivized and there's some more questionnaire that are not incentivized, but might be giving information and might be things that the authors are using as well, those information. So that might be part of the data, but they are not incentivized. Now, to say that there are data for theory paper might be a little bit silly, but this actually goes back to the question on what exactly data means for a paper. And I was thinking about, as a theorist, of course, my first reaction is that I don't have data in my paper, and actually this is a lot of time what I say as well, because once I say I don't have data in my paper, in my research, then I don't have to submit a data management plan, so that is kind of good for me, right? But in a sense, data is the link from ideas to things that actually work or matter. And if I think of that, even theory paper has the component of going from how the idea was like to how it actually works. Now, typically, if you have a theory paper that is, say, proposing a theorem or proposing a solution concept or proposing a modeling approach, then these papers almost are obliged to include hypothetical examples that shows that what they are proposing works better than existing theorems, solutions, or models. And even if the authors don't want to do it, the editor and referee will force them to do it. Because if you're proposing something new, of course, I need to know why I need to have some new things. You need to show that the thing is useful, right? And this is, and I have to tell you that as a theorist, this is often the hardest part of any theory paper. Proving a theorem actually is not that hard. I mean, if you have enough experience, but finding an example that your theorem works while other theorems do not work is a very, very hard thing. And you want a good example as well. So I tend to feel that that is the data for a theory paper. That is the part where a theory paper needs to show that it does connect to application. Another way that, if it is more applied theory paper, then typically then those papers will have either anecdotal or what we call stylized observations that matches the model predictions better than the competing theories. And those are, again, how the theory are being applied to something that actually works or that actually operates. So if you do have a theory paper and you are pitching it, reverse pitching it, or you are pitching your own theory proposal, feel free to put these examples as your data rather than just leaving the whole data session out. Of course, this might actually be shorter for you if you're working on a theory paper and you probably want to assign more words to the tools, to the ideas or the tools part, and have less on the data part. That is actually very reasonable. But I don't think that this part is necessarily completely empty. There can still be something about it, about quote and unquote data when we come to theory paper. Where to find it? This is actually one part that is quite easy to fill out. And indeed, if I'm writing a paper, and we'll get to it later in the semester when we talk about writing, if I'm writing a paper, data description or experimental design is usually the first thing that I will start on. I don't start on with the introduction when I write, because these are very factual information, what are the data, what is the experimental design. So those are the places that you can find it. For theory paper though, examples and applications are actually the harder part. Okay, we have ideas, we have data, but then we need some tools so that those ideas can work on the data, right? Those are the machinery. Now, for some paper, this might just be some very standard tool given the idea, right? If I just want to see the effects of something, it might just be really running an OLS or a GLS or matching moments. That's it, to estimate all those parameters. And if that is the case, it's all right to just say, okay, this is the tool, it's a two-stage least square, or it is a method of moments, it is a GLS, it is a what was it, the Hackey, what was it called? I forgot. See, my econometrics is really bad. The Hackman two-step, yes, for selection model, for instance. So just put down those tools. For papers with secondary data, then these are typically econometrics model or particular econometric techniques to overcome data obstacle. And if you do want to, you can also note that they might have used econometric methods for robustness check. In case you don't understand what is a robustness check, is basically extensions, to try to see whether some alternative hypothesis might, it's the author's idea, it's the author's effort to show that the alternative hypotheses are not true. For experimental data, I mentioned hot lottery here as well. So tools for eliciting certain information, for instance, any experimental design that is specific to that type of experiment. For instance, if it is an experiment on repeated games, then, do they use random termination or some other termination rules? You might also want to note the statistical tools used for analyzing the data, because experimental data, they usually have a small sample size because, as I said, it's costly to have a big sample. So they tend to use non-parametric estimation. So it might be it might be important to note what statistical tools they are using. And, oh, sorry, I put data here. It's actually not data, it is tools, sorry. For theory paper, then the tools will be the type of the proof, whether it is an induction proof, a constructive proof, or a proof by contradiction. And very often you want to note whether the paper has used some particular special mathematical or statistical theorems used in the proof, because sometimes indeed the advancement of theory paper might be to use a more advanced mathematical theorem that would allow us to prove something that's more general than what had been done before. A very classic example, well, this is actually not classic. I mean, this is actually is the same thing, but Nash proved the existence of Nash equilibrium by constructing a very specific correspondence and then use the Brouwer fixed point theorem. Now, that was a genius proof, I have to say. The way that he constructed that particular correspondence, but not a correspondence, a function. But in terms of from the point of strategy of proof, it's actually not very ideal because it relies on that very ingenious construction. So later, Arrow comes along and he has the Kakutani fixed point theorem, which is more general and applied to correspondence. Then he used a very easy, very intuitive best reply correspondent and prove the existence of Nash equilibrium. Basically the same way, but he has a different mathematical theorem that allows him to do different things. So sometimes that's really the tool in a theory paper. Where to find information on the tools? Well, you need to look in the main sessions. When I mean main session, it means not the introduction, not the conclusion, not the extension, but the other part. What are they called? Depends on what the paper, what type of paper it is. Now, I should stress that the tools might be more hidden, especially when they are standard, because nobody is going to trumpet around that says I use an OLS, right? So if it is some really standard tool, you might need to look in a little bit of how the work is being done, but it shouldn't be very hard to find either. You just need to look in. Typically, these tools are not hidden in some very detailed proof. I mean, because these are the main tools to make things work. You should be able to see it, it would be mentioned somewhere even before it is carried out. Okay, so that kind of covers the how part, the idea, data, and tools. Is there any questions, by the way? I know I have been talking nonstop. Okay, so we got the how. So we covered the how already, right? So if the first part of the first 4 ABCD is kind of the what, and then the ideas, data, and tools are the how, then now the last part is the why. Why should anyone care about this research? So it comes in a few ways. The first thing is what's new. Now, I should stress that this part, what's new, is about the novelty of the research itself. It's not so much about the novelty of the result. So why, in a sense, one way to think about this question is, why hadn't the same research been done before? Why hadn't the question been answered before? It must be because the people before, have had difficulty answering the question, and therefore, it wasn't answered before, and there's some innovation in this paper that allows us to overcome those obstacles. And that's the what's new. What are the innovations that allow us to achieve something that wasn't done before? Is it novelty in the idea? Sometimes it is the data or the tool. So the Nash equilibrium examples I have given is actually the novelty is in the tool. Sometimes the novelty is in the data that the authors are able to assess a, put together or assess a data set that nobody had ever had before, and that actually is the data set that can give us the answer. Sometimes it's the ideas, like we have a new idea of identifying something. Now, where to find the novelty? It got to be in the introduction, because if there's something new about the paper and the author does not try to say what is new in the introduction, then something must be wrong. Either that those innovations are not new, or the authors are too modest, and no authors are modest. Let me just put it that way. So it got to be in the introduction. However, I do want to say that do not confuse about what's new with contribution, which we are going to come to later. What's new is really about what is the innovation of the paper. Contribution is more what is the result of those innovations. So what those innovation buys us. So what's new is really, what is the innovation that allows us to overcome previous obstacle and push to new ground? Now that's very well. You have a research idea. You know how to do it, and you can claim that there's something new in your research that nobody has done before or nobody has realized before. But then there is the question: so what? And I have to say that I get this question very often. I say, okay, I have this new idea, I have done this research, very nice. The editor asked me, so what? I just don't think that this is interesting enough for our journal, right? Or people, I go to a seminar, people ask, why should I pay attention to your research? So yes, it might be something new, it might be something difficult, it might be something that nobody else has done before, but why should anyone care? Why is finding the answer to that research question important? And also, who might be interested to know this answer? And also, one of the key things that economists like to say is policy implication, right? What decision or behavior or activity may be influenced by the answer. So if we learn the answer, what is going to change? Now, of course, somehow I have to admit that, ultimately the value of a research is in the eyes of the beholder, right? So someone decide to research, some people in humanities want to research a particular literature in 300 CE, or there must be some value to it. I'm not saying that humanities research are useless. So, but then of course the way to write this, why should anyone care, will be different, right? They might be saying that because understanding those literature can help us understand what's happening in the society, what was happening back then, or how our language developed or something like that. But still they have their so what? It might not be that it would help change, it will help stop climate change or something, or it might not help controlling inflation, but there's still some value to it, and we need to argue that value. For economics paper, the so what is usually either in the, but usually both in the introduction or conclusion. And you want to look for words like policy implications, welfare implications, applications, because economists really like these phrases. So especially the word policy implications. And here the word policy is actually used very loosely. It basically just means that any implications on any real actions or activity. Now, after so what is the contribution? Which, as I said, is different from the what's new in the sense that it is what this research has brought us relative to the literature. So, you know, what is the advancement of knowledge, or what future research can it inspire? And here, when you are doing reverse pitching, this is the point that it starts to link towards your own research question. A paper have done something, and very often if you are reading a good paper, you would have the impression that basically the authors have done everything that they could have thought of, and they are not leaving much space for other people. But you can still ask, what are the future research that it is inspiring? And that is actually giving you a pathway forward. You want to use this paper for your own research. If this paper is all good and new and everything is done, it doesn't leave much room for you. But when we are talking about the contribution of the paper, there must also be something that is being left out, or something that it is actually pointing to or suggesting that, you know, that should be the direction that we should be going. And that's also part of the contribution. And that's also part that is very relevant to you. Typically, you can find the contribution in the introduction or conclusion. But just beware, you know, a lot of people like to say the contribution of this paper is blah, blah, blah. And whether what follows that is what is the contribution that we are talking here, or it might be the what's new or policy implication. So you do need to distinguish between those, because when we are writing a paper, we are not thinking about this pitching framework. So we are not going to distinguish between different kinds of contribution. Now, the other thing that you might note also is that, as I say, you know, what future research can it inspire? Sometimes if you read the conclusion, usually this happens in the conclusion, and the author will point out something that they have not solved and say, you know, this is possible future research. Now, if you are thinking about just research being inspired, you know, that is fine. But if you are really thinking of carrying those out, let me just warn you that as an author, if I could have done anything that I'm suggesting, I would have done them already. You know, the reason that I'll put it down as a possible future research question is because I cannot do that, and I do not know how to do it. So, you know, if you do, I normally discourage students from picking up direct, you know, possible future research from conclusion, unless they have a very good idea of what can be done towards those research questions. Otherwise, the reason that they are just left as possible future research suggestions is probably because either they are not worth doing, or the authors have no idea of how it can be done. And if they have some slight idea of how it can be done, but I'm not very sure, normally they will ask their PhD student to do it anyway. So, you know, and you won't be fast enough to compete with those PhD students. Okay, this is the last part of a reverse pitch, which is the key finding. And this is a part that is not present in a normal classic pitch, because Sorry. Yeah, sorry, I just lost my internet connection. Okay, let's hope that wouldn't happen again. Okay, let me find the thing. Sorry about this. Okay, I'm really sorry about this. I don't know what's happening. Where was I? Yes, I was saying that these key findings should link with the research questions because they should be answering the research question. They should be coming out from the hows, the ideas, data, and tools. And they should illustrate the so what and the contributions, right? If you're claiming that your research matters, then the findings or the answers should matter and the contribution should matter. Now, one thing that if you note the template actually has said was that you might want to, when you are summarizing these findings, you might want to note whether your summary is coming not objectively, but kind of coming from what the author thinks the main findings are, or whether it is coming from your evaluation of what the main findings should be from your perspective. It's not right or wrong because we are looking at, different people are looking at different questions, right? What is a key finding to you might not be the same key finding to the authors. Something that might not be of huge importance to the authors might be of interest to you. So you can have a different angle. Just be clear that that is your angle. Now, where to find the findings? Abstract. People usually do note the main findings in the abstract. Introduction, conclusion, you should be able to see it. Okay, sorry, and this is a very long way of me just talking. But then ultimately, what I want to emphasize is that this reverse pitch is for you, right? It is for you as a tool for you to cut through the literature, cut through the paper. And so a good reverse pitch, what makes it good is that it should be useful. Now, what makes it useful? It should be clear and to the point, which is also why earlier you were asking, just one sentence to cover the research question. Just think about it. If you had used 10 sentences to cover the research questions, after a month, when you pull it out again, are you going to understand what you had written? I mean, this is really something that sometimes we feel that we can cram a lot of things by writing things down, but then actually if we put it aside for a while and take it back out later, we don't even understand what we have written. And if that is the case, then it is useless. So, and when you make things clear and to the point, and even if you looked at it, say 6 months later, you might say, oh, I didn't realize that I had written this, but you can still understand what you were writing. And that would be a good pitch because it helps you store the information there. The pitch should be logical and coherent because as you can see, the elements are actually interconnected, right? Although we try to separate them as different elements, somehow, and the reason that we might need to differentiate them is exactly because they are connected. So they should together make sense. The tools or the how should help to answer the question. And the answer to the question should make the contribution or the policy implications that is stated later. So there should be a logical relationship within that pitch, even though item seems to be separated. The pitch should be informative, meaning that you should be able to recover the most basic elements of the underlying research. even without reading it through very carefully. This is kind of like a note that you have written that summarize the research for you so that you don't have to keep reading the same thing over and over again. So it should be informative. If looking at your page, you still feel that, oh, I need to go back to the paper to find out information that I have already put it, that are supposed to be put into the page, then the page is not a good one because it's not informative. It hasn't done its job of helping you to summarize the paper. And finally, I should say this is particular for reverse pitch, is that it should be constructive in the sense that it should point out possible directions for you. It shouldn't be an end in itself. It should help you see how you can go forward. You know, there are a lot of great papers out there, and they are very good. No question about that. But you need to see a direction from those papers. Otherwise, those are just good papers that we can put in a trophy cupboard for everyone to see, but it has nothing to do with you. For that paper to be relevant to you, it should point out possible direction for your own research to go ahead. So I have talked for a very long time, so you might be thinking, I don't want to say any more of this anymore. But especially if you want to see examples, because a reverse pitch is a big thing. So I can't really do an example with you right here in the class. Otherwise, you know, just the time that we need to read the paper and fill out everything would take more than a whole class already. So do feel free to go to this website. If you look at module 3 is about reverse pitching, and you can also look at module 2, which is pitching. And you can find examples, you can find videos there. And our next workshop actually is also a chance to reverse pitch a paper. So I'm picking out some possible paper just randomly, or not really randomly, papers that are interesting for you to have some exercise in research pitch. So if you would like to have that hands-on experience, feel free to go to the workshop. And again, you know, this website contains quite a lot of useful resources for you too. Now, whenever we are talking about these use of literature, then the question always come up is, how detailed should I read the paper? If you remember when I was talking about the annotated bibliography, I said, you know, you probably don't need to go into the technical details of the paper. At this point now, you can't just read the abstract and the introduction. You may or may not be able to skip the appendices. Depends on what the appendices are. But I do want to, but if that gives you an impression that you need to go into every details of the paper, then that's not true either. Having a good overall understanding of a paper is different from knowing every detail of that paper. What I mean especially is that when it comes to technical details, technical materials like equations or anything with a lot of symbols, it happens so frequently and it becomes a common obstacle to many students that they react to technical materials differently from how they react to words, English. And the two typical reactions that are not helpful, that are not constructive, is either fear and awe. Now, fear is easy to understand. I see something that I see a page full of equation. Oh, usually it won't be, but I see an equation and then I freak out and I say, I don't know what this equation is about. That's one way. And then another reaction that is also not healthy is that I see an equation. It must be something very important. You know, this must be something advanced. I need to understand it. Now, let me just say that neither of these attitudes are necessary or healthy, although they are super common. And I say this in other classes, but I say this particularly for this course, that mathematics is just another language. So anything that is put in mathematics is just some content that the author thinks it will be more effectively expressed in mathematics than in words. For instance, if I want to put down a linear regression equation, an OLS equation, writing that y equals to alpha plus beta x, plus some epsilon term, that probably is the easiest way of expressing the relationship between y and all the x and how we think that the errors term, the randomness comes in, than trying to express it in English, and therefore we put down the OLS equation. Is OLS very difficult? No. It's the first econometric models that you will have learned in any econometric class. But why do we choose to put an OLS equation in math rather than in words? Well, that is the easiest way of putting it. Same thing for any other thing, right? If I try to write down a game and I say a game is G equals to, brackets, AI, UI, I runs from I in the set of player N, it's not because I particularly like this notation, but that is the easiest way for me to define a game. And then later I can refer to A and U and N and G like that. So the choice of these, if it is a good paper, the choice of the technical material, the technical terms and the technical content, the symbols and English is really what makes the expression clearest, right? What is the most effective way of expressing the idea should be chosen. And if that happens to be some equations, then that equation be it. If it happens to be English, then English be it. Sometimes there are jargons too. Jargon also does not make anything particularly more advanced or important, right? It's a jargon is really a kind of shorthand for a more for an idea that might require a lot of words to write out. Therefore, I use the jargon. So I might write utility maximization rather than trying to spell out the whole consumer problem, right? So what that means is that you really just want to recover the content and not be distracted by the form. You don't want to be distracted by the by the math. You don't want to be distracted by the jargon. Sometimes, and it's very common, right? Students see the jargon in something and then start thinking that, oh, this is very important. I need to look it up, and then I need to look up all the class notes that I have seen this before. That actually might be quite, sometimes it might be necessary, but sometimes it is not. Sometimes it is really just, that's the way that the author want to convey the information in a concise way. Excuse me. So therefore, what do you do when you come to these contexts? It's just like when you read a book, let's say you're reading a fiction and come across a word that you do not know. Most of us, if the reading is efficient, we just read on and see if the meaning of the word might become apparent by itself as you read on. Only when that word comes up so often or its usage is at a point that not knowing it interferes with your comprehension, then you should stop and look up a dictionary. So the same with any technical materials that you encounter when you're reading a literature. Read on. If after reading on for a little while, the meaning of either that equation or that jargon or those symbols becomes apparent, then you can feel safe and free to keep moving without paying too much, without having to go back and take out everything. But if not understanding, it really now interferes with your understanding of the later materials, then you probably should stop and look it up and see what it is. But if you get into the reactive habit of whenever you see something technical, then you freak out, and you either freak out or you feel that this is so important and that you have to make something out of it, then that is probably going to interfere with your comprehension and understanding as well. And that's not a good habit to have. So that's basically what I want to say about reverse pitching. But before I stop, I would also just like to mention a little bit about how we approach literature in general, especially for thesis. Most theses will have a section or a chapter called literature review, and sometimes they even require to have one. And whereas if you are reading journal articles, you would notice that very often there's not a separate session called literature review. And the reason of this discrepancy is that most schools want the student to describe their understanding of the literature landscape, while journals really don't care whether the authors understand the literature or not. But then, what do we mean by understanding the literature landscape? Because this is something that school typically like students to do. When we are talking about research, understanding the literature is not about answering quiz questions on a paper. Like what I said at the beginning of this lecture, it's not about being able to tell everything about a paper on top of your head, although that typically becomes a result. It's about telling a story of how our knowledge on a particular topic is developed and accumulated. So, at first, it was almost like what I told you just now about the Nash equilibrium, right? At first, Nash does this, and in order to do this, he needs to come up with that function that was ingenious, but it's not intuitive. Later, arrows come along, he has the Kakutani fixed point theorem, therefore he can do it with an intuitive correspondence. That was the story of how our understanding of existence of Nash equilibrium is developed. And actually, I can tell you even more story after that, because there are some cases that existence has not been established and how we actually got to the point that we are at right now. But that is exactly what I meant by understanding the literature. We know how things are being accumulated, what are being added at each point, and why an innovation is being made at each point. And that's the thing that you want to achieve. You want to have good knowledge about how these things come by. But because it is telling a story, it is not repeating everything. Whenever you tell this story, whenever you summarize the story, you need to exercise a judgment. What should be included, what should not be included? And that judgment is related to your understanding of the discipline and what you are trying to do. Just now, when I tell you the story about the Nash equilibrium existence, I haven't talked about continuity of the payoff function. Actually, that was the story after these two papers, and then later we have a lot of things that happens about continuity of the payoff function. But just now, for the story that I want to tell you, continuity of the payoff function is not important, and therefore I didn't tell you about that. So that is a judgment that is being exercised at the point of telling that story. So how to have a good judgment, it is related to how you understand the literature, the discipline. It is related to how you understand the message that you would like to get across. Now, if I said this and then you start feeling a bit blue because you feel I don't have this judgment right now, let me just say that it can be trained and it needs to be trained as well. It's not something that people just have as an innate ability. It comes by training. which is why when you start doing research, you have a supervisor, because that supervisor is there to train you up on your judgment. So that's all that I need to say for today. Any questions? Well, if there's no more question, then I won't keep you for any longer. I'm just going to stop the recording and